I've had a bun there from my brother, and it's made my throat all thick now. So,
What the hell is a bun?
a bun.
What is a bun?
A B-U-N. Stop saying bon. It's a B-U-N. A bun. B-U-N.
Jesus, it's your bloody Irish accent, man. A bun?
What's a bun? What's a bon? I never heard of a bon. A B-O-N.
Well, exactly. But that's what you're saying. Your brother made you a bun, and I had no idea what you're talking
No, he
about.
brought me a
would
bun.
Why would it have anything to do with your throat either?
Well, because it was made with cream. Anyway, okay, let's crack on. Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is Tokyo Jazz Joints podcast, and this is 6 Kyushu Joints Part 2. James, you left us on a bit of a cliffhanger in the last episode, and thanks to COVID and obviously geography, I'm currently living vicariously through your experiences and your recent trip to Kyushu. All right, so we've been to the 3 places, James. You started on a Thursday night. In a rainy Miyazaki. Went to a couple of places. We had Lifetime, then we had Far Cry, and then the following day you headed up the coast a bit, which was the Friday, and you went to yet another downbeat. And then we decided to break it there and stop, and you kind of left it dangling a bit because you reckon that the next place that you went to is going to blow even those 3 amazing places out of the water. So no pressure, but where did you go to next?
Well, the next joint, which was about maybe a 10 or 15 minute walk through Takanabe, again, quote marks, city, to a little street where there were a bunch of different, sort of yakitori, small Japanese pubs and snack bars and whatnot. And I come across, I had known the address. I had spoken to the owner on the phone. It's a place called Dolphy. He said that, the opening hours generally at 8 p.m., but in the afternoon, he's open as a curry shop. So if I'm going to be coming in between the afternoon curry cafe and the jazz bar, just to call and let him know. So already I was rather confused because Philip, you and I have been to how many? More than 150 places just together.
Yep.
And they have different shapes and they have different, ways of doing business, but we've not encountered one that's open as a curry restaurant.
The closest I think we came was it Jazz Kappa, the place that was a kind of an izakaya with, it was almost like a jazz kisa that had evolved into a izakaya, right? Because they still had this great sound system. Right. They still had some records, but it was very much like a restaurant.
Yeah, like fried snacks and beers. Yeah, that's right. That was also in Kyushu, actually, in Kumamoto.
It was, yeah.
That's right. So I come down and I get there and he's not open yet. But I see this absolutely remarkable shutter, which is the cover of Eric Dolphy's Out to Lunch. You know, the kind of like shutter gate that you pull down.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I'm just like, oh my God. I mean, that was worth coming to Kyushu just to see this, because we've seen, I love a good jazz bar sign, okay? Especially when they're lit up and the kind that you put out on the street, like a little lamp, that's the kind of the classic thing you think of a Japanese urban landscape, are these signs that are out there. But we've never seen one. We've never seen a gate that was painted like this. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was just knocked out. So, I wait around a few minutes and I wander around the neighborhood. I come back and then he's in there. And again, he's waiting for me, because I had come and left. And he's like, oh, great. Come on in. You found it. I was a little worried because I didn't know how to reach you. And I was like, but I left you my cell phone number. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. I don't use cell phones. I'm analog. Again, another analog guy. So immediately I was just completely happy to talk with him. Anytime you hear that, you're going to get some good jazz stories. So I sit down. His name is Fujisawa-san. He is 61 years old. He's been running Dolphy for about 30 years. He opened in 1993. First he had a little bit of a smaller counter bar, and then he moved to the current place, which is pretty large. I think you could probably get about 40 to 50 people in there. He said 75 if they're doing a gig, but that would be a little bit tight. But he's run the place there now for 22 years, since 2000. He's how can I describe this guy? I mean, he has a collection of Scotch whiskey in there that I think would impress even a bar in Scotland. I counted 42 different distillery brands just behind the counter. And he said, oh, no, there's much more if I go around back. He said he has over 75 types of Scotch. So again, I'm just thinking to myself, oh, shit, it's 6 o'clock. I've got to get the train back, but I think I might want to start drinking Scotch with this guy. But he said it was too early to drink for him, so I just stuck to having a beer. But that jumped out at me. I mean, the amount of distilleries that he was able to hook up with from way down in Miyazaki. I asked him about, how did you do this? And he said, well, some of these brands, it was really difficult. I actually had to write to them in Scotland and ask them to hook up with a Japanese, trading company so that they would send it here. Some of the brands that he was selling, I mean, I think he said the most expensive one was about 6,000 yen for a shot. So what is that, about $50? So you're talking, some pretty rare whiskeys. In addition to that, obviously, he's tons and tons of records. I would say he had about maybe 3,000 behind the bar. But the coolest thing of all was that I asked him about the history of, again, I'm so interested whenever we go to these regional places of what was the jazz scene like. So we talked about in the last episode that at Far Cry, Kusano-san was talking about Sonny Rollins. And so Fujisawa-san said right away, oh, yeah, of course. I was at those gigs. I've seen Sonny Rollins play many times here. And he started talking about how, it was really important that they bring those jazz musicians to Miyazaki because they don't go to Tokyo very often. He said that he's only been to the Tokyo metro region maybe 2 or 3 times in his life, and very rarely even goes to Miyazaki City. So he said that it was, him and his regular customers through the years made a really, really concerted effort to work with the local university to promote and to basically sponsor these kinds of jazz events. And that kicked into a memory, Philip. Do you remember when we went to Mokuba in Gunma, the site of the famous Tachibana recording? And we asked him about, how did you guys fund this? And he said that, well, they often would play either in the sort of local city civic hall or they would play at a university auditorium, and the universities would sort of subsidize it. Yeah. So, it's kind of kicked in that a lot of these regional towns, one of the ways they could do this was because they were getting some support from the universities. So in the midst of this conversation, we're going back and forth, and, he's telling me and again, I asked him, I was like, okay, you said you don't have a cell phone, so I guess that's why you don't have a website. He's like, no, I don't have a website. I have a scrapbook. He pulls out a gigantic loose leaf ring binder, which must have 300 pages in it. And he starts showing me pictures from the last 30 years of everything from him hanging out with the art ensemble of Chicago when they drank sake together, playing in Miyazaki, right next to him holding like a 30-kilogram fish that he and his buddies had caught, brought back outside of the jazz bar and fried it up right there on a little barbecue in front of Dolphy. So, I mean, we're talking about, this is not Tokyo, okay? This lifestyle is completely different. He shows me all these pictures of him fishing, cycling, and then sitting next to like Art Blakey when Art Blakey played Japan in the 1980s. And, one picture after another in this old scrapbook. And he's like, yeah, this is my version of a blog, but, I've looked at the internet, but I don't know how to use it. So, I just keep these pictures and I show people when they want to see them. And Philip, how many times have I said this, man? We've walked into places not knowing what we're going to expect. But this was the last thing I expected, was to see him sitting next to Joseph Jarman in the art ensemble. And then the next picture is some gigantic, frightening-looking creature from the sea that they just immediately fried up and started eating outside of Dolphy.
It's astonishing, really, isn't it? I mean, it's so... I mean, where do you even start? I mean, I think, to me, the first thing you've got to kind of bear in mind is that not only in this tiny place... Takanabe, which, we're sort of loosely calling a city, not only, and, we've all had that experience. You maybe go to a small town and you find some amazing restaurant or bar or record shop. But the fact that there's 2 of these places two of these stunning like jazz cafes in this same tiny place is the first thing that stands out to me. But I think also what's really interesting, and like I've been starting to look at this a lot in my own sort of like research around photography, and this idea of like collecting and archiving and how much overlap there is, and just to hear, not only is it records, but like also he's kind of creating this archive of whiskeys. And then that also extends to this kind of mentality where you're recording everything in a scrapbook and documenting your life in that way, which is what we're all doing, like by posting every day on Instagram. It's just that he has chosen not to make that move online. But there's something about that mentality, and I think it does really come across, particularly with record collectors. And there's actually quite a lot of research written about collecting and this mentality around records and how you create a collection and how it helps you and to understand the wider world and see the wider world. And like, it's just fascinating that not only is he doing that with records, but also with whiskeys, and then like his own life and mixing like his kind of professional, in quotation marks, his professional life as this bar owner and his private life, like as, a fisherman and hanging out with his mates and stuff. I mean, it's staggering. And also I just love the poetry of sitting outside a huge shutter that says "out to lunch" and frying up fish in the street. I mean, what, you couldn't write it.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, but like you said, I mean, and what's interesting is, we've visited so many places with much, much older owners. Fujisawa-san is 61. That's only 13 years older than me. And yet I felt that there was definitely a distinct, at least a technological divide, because he's showing me pictures from this old scrapbook, and then I'm pulling my phone out to show him some pictures from Instagram of the places I've been visiting. You know? But the sentiment was the same. And as you mentioned about the collector aspect of it, not just that sort of ethos or interest, but there's something very uniquely Japanese about that. Like, it's not a coincidence that whether it's jazz albums or whether it's people who are maniacal about collecting anime or whatever. I mean, if you look at so many different genres of things, the world's top collectors are often in Japan. And you know that from living here. Like, when Japanese fans of something dive in, they're going to dive in 100% and become more knowledgeable about it than an expert back in our own countries. That's just a fact. I mean, we've met them in so many different, not even just music. It could be anything. It could be baseball. It could be films. Like, when people study something here, it's part of the way that they study it. They don't do it at half measures. And
no, I think it's an attention to detail, I think, which, again, you see all over Japan, in every aspect. But I think there's a kind of a completist mentality, I think. So you're in and you're all in, so you're in there to get the rarest records or the most complete set. And we've seen that, haven't we? I mean, wasn't it in Big Boy where he had like that complete set of Blue Note?
That's right.
On CD and stuff like that,
Yes,
so
Big Boy in Jimbocho in Tokyo. Yes.
So what? Where did it go then? You obviously hung around and then headed off. So we're still.
So I hang out with Fujisawa-san. I've only got about an hour because, again, I've got to get back to. There's just no trains, And then I see a picture of somebody wearing a Dolphy T-shirt in a picture behind the bar, and I'm like, oh wow. Those are really cool. I wish you still had some. He's like, I think I might have one somewhere. Let me see. No. So he goes and rummages behind it, and he pulls out a T-shirt, and the front is Eric Dolphy's Out to Lunch, and the back is just a red square that says Jazz Spot Dolphy Takanabe 1993. And believe me, I had my wallet out within a nanosecond to purchase one of those. And I'm so sorry, Philip, he only had one left. So couldn't get you one of those. I do have another present for you from the trip, but we'll save that for when you visit.
Oh, that's good. That's something, I suppose. But I mean, wow. I mean, and, that probably made up for your lack of mug collection, did it? From other Kyushu joints?
I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. The picture I took of Fujisawa-san outside his shop, when he pulled the actual gate down, because he's like, oh, you got to get a picture of the gate. And I was like, yes, please. unbelievably, that picture has probably gotten twice as much traction as anything else I've ever put up. So, people.
So 3
people
likes rather than
the unique. Well, we're not all professional photographers, I mean, come on, just a humble podcaster here in Yokohama. So, but that was Dolphy. That was Dolphy, and I mean, I came out of there on a high. I got the train back to Aoshima because I had an early start the next day to get up to Fukuoka, and I think if by now people who've been looking at a map, they may be thinking, why did you spend the third day of your trip going all the way to the opposite end of the island, to the northwest city of Fukuoka? Why not just stay down south? Philip, I think you mentioned it earlier, the Japanese rail companies are doing these amazing sort of like 3-day or 5-day passes where you can just hop on and off the trains. So what would have cost you normally $500 to make these various journeys, you can just hop on and off as much as you want for like $250. So I took advantage of that, and I took the train from Miyazaki all the way down south via Kagoshima back around to Fukuoka City, arriving in Fukuoka about 2 p.m.
And Fukuoka is one of those places, like, I mean, I have to confess, it's the first time I'd been to it was actually with you, but it's sort of talked about a lot. Like, I don't know whether I've built this sort of mysticism around it or this mystique rather, whether I've built this mystique around it in my head, but like, it seems to be the kind of, there's something about it feels like an alternative in the sense that it's kind of it has all the good things about Tokyo without all the bad things. Like, it's smaller, it's close to the coast, it's a bit more internationally minded. It has that sort of like historical influence, perhaps more so from the countries across the water, China and Korea. And there's just something like a vibrancy about it, that seems, at least in my head anyway, to be kind of like all the good bits of Tokyo without the bad bits. And I know we talked similarly about Sapporo, but obviously with Sapporo, you've got like the extreme cold in the winter. And if you're into like winter sports and stuff, then great. But there's something about Fukuoka. And I know certainly that when we visited together, I mean, I absolutely adored it. I thought it was a great place.
Yeah, I had that. I mean, this was I would say the fourth or fifth time I've been there. And 100% agree with you. It's more navigable in Tokyo, but it's still a very big city. It actually is even more international. But as you mentioned, I mean, Fukuoka is closer to Busan and Shanghai than it is to Tokyo. So in non-pandemic times, it's always got thousands of tourists from Korea, China, Singapore, even as far away as Australia. It's surrounded by the hills, but it's on the water. It's got tons of canals. It's walkable. It's just fantastic. And of course, for my purposes, it's got some fantastic jazz joints. So, I got up there, I dropped off my bag, but rather than just staying in Fukuoka City, I couldn't get this close and not go back to a place that I think we must have spent at least an hour or more talking about on various earlier episodes. In the suburb of Fukuoka, 30 minutes south by train in Tosu City in Saga Prefecture is, to me, it's the temple of jazz. It's Coltrane. And I had to get back there. You can go back and listen to our full, I believe you called it, 5 days in, was it 5 days in June? Our special
It's the 5
series?
days in June series. Yeah, I think there's actually 7 or 8 episodes in the end. So you can find that again in all the usual places. But if you go to tokyojazzjoints.com, you'll find it there in the podcast tab. And that was our trip in Kyushu. And obviously we took in Coltrane, and quite a few other places in Kyushu, but a couple in Fukuoka. But I think probably again, Coltrane for both of us. And that's where I also had that experience that you've clearly had on this particular trip of when we got there the first time. It was a real dash that day. We'd been all over the island and we were really cutting it fine. And we got there sort of about, I think 30 minutes before he was about to close. And they were, of course, waiting for us. There's no other customers. And I mean, the place just blew us away, didn't it? I mean, it's just from the huge, I don't know what, 20-foot tall mural of Coltrane on the side of this green wooden slat building to the repository of Coltrane history that he has inside, both, records, vinyl, and then just other memorabilia, right down to the cups and the saucers and the ashtrays. I mean, it's just a staggering place, isn't it?
Completely. And it was really interesting to walk in for the second time, though, in a different state, not quite as harried.
Yeah.
Much earlier in the day, on a Saturday afternoon, cafe time. So I walk in. There are no other customers at the moment. But I walk in, and the old fella is sitting there, and he's reading his newspaper, having his cigarette. And his wife is behind the counter, and she's washing a coffee mug, so it's probably somebody had just left. But what was very interesting was this time there was a TV that I don't recall being there when we visited. A TV hanging sort of at the end of the bar towards the back right of the big room. And it's on, it's muted, but it's showing a baseball game. And as some of our very astute listeners may know, or if you listen to my own podcast, you'll know how big of a baseball fan I am. So for me to walk into Coltrane, which is, again, an absolute temple to St. John himself, to be walking in there, hearing the music, but also getting to watch a baseball game and having a beer, I thought I had died and gone to heaven, man. I was like, this is it for me. This is pretty much everything I'll need, So I sat down, I was like, and I wasn't going to be drinking. I was going to get a coffee. And then I looked at the time and I was like, forget it. I got to get a beer. So, they bring me a bottle of beer. And then I just kind of say to the couple, I say, maybe you don't remember me, but I came here about 4 years ago. It was quite late at night. You waited for us. And they looked at me, in about 5 seconds, and then she got a big smile on her face. And she's like, I remember you, of course. You came to
I'm
take
so
pictures.
glad.
And I was like, yeah, thank you. I it was so rushed this time, and I'm back in town, so I had to come back to spend some more time here. And then, and he actually, because I think we covered this on our episode, Philip, I thought that he was, I wouldn't say in bad health, but he was fairly old. I found out this time he's about to turn 80. It could have been the time of day, though, because we got there so late.
It was pretty late, it was 10:30 p.m. and,
Yeah. He was much, much more energized and engaging.
Oh, amazing.
Time. Talked to me about my trip. Talked to me about the baseball. There was, by that point, another old guy who came in and sat down and were watching the game, and they were sort of ribbing each other because one of them was a Giants fan and the other one was a Tigers fan, the big rivals of the Japanese Baseball League. And they're both about 80 years old, So they're talking about the baseball. Meanwhile, he's playing this unbelievably cool record by Yusef Lateef, So I'm like, I'm just having a ball, man.
Yeah.
And then, so I talked to them for a bit. I go back to my seat, to take some notes and just sort of soak it in, because I'm by myself. And I'm like, okay, I don't have to rush now. I can just sit here for the next hour and soak it in. And she comes up and she gives me a small plate with a manju cake, a little Japanese sweet. And she's like, oh, here, this is for you, some service. And I was just, man, Philip, man, I was just.
It's amazing. I'm just looking at the photos actually, and just remember living it through your second visit. But the TV is actually there, but we just didn't notice it. It was off, and it's actually just hanging over by the right hand speaker. So it's obviously been there. But just looking at it, I mean, the photos just bring back that night of like what a mental sort of mad day it had been. And then just looking at that room of like him in that room with those records just all filed beautifully. And then just like little random things like the hat hanging up. There's a boomerang above the DJ, the sort of like the music room. And then obviously the pile of T-shirts and sweaters that they were selling over on the right-hand side. I mean, it's just... what a place. Like, I mean, it just is incredible, really.
Well, I asked him about if he had any more goods to sell. Because remember, we bought sweatshirts.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And he said, he's actually getting some more made because next year is the 40th anniversary of the place. And so I was like, okay, you know what? That's great. I'll be here. I'll come back down.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll pick up some more. Because he was actually wearing the kind of like, not the sweatshirt, he was wearing some sort of like the thin rain slicker. It doesn't get very cold down in Fukuoka. So it's just this kind of thin one with a little hood. And it has the Coltrane like, logo on the back with the address and the picture of John.
You weren't tempted to add to the raincoat collection?
You know what? I was really tempted to be like, hey, could I just buy yours? You know, because it rains a lot in Yokohama. You know, you don't need it. You live above the bar. You don't go outside, you know? But no, I thought that maybe be a little bit pushy. And I didn't steal the plate that the manju cake came on.
Good.
You know,
I'm glad to hear it.
It went through my mind.
That seems like that would be bad karma, I think.
I think that would be insulting to them and to the legacy of St. John's sort of teachings.
There you go.
So, but yeah, all of the coffee cups and the ashtrays and the mugs, they're all still there behind the bar. The photos, the sound system, the record booth in the back. It's all still there, and but he was telling me, he said, you know, they've been able to withstand the pandemic because they don't rely on live sessions. They only have live sessions very occasionally there.
Right, yeah, because they do have that sign up, don't they, behind the counter of a band called The Blue Trains. Or the Blue Trains for anyone who doesn't speak katakana, but yeah, the Blue Trains. So they obviously do have some live music, but like you said, it's not a kind of a standard thing.
Yeah, and while I was there, you know, I mean, it was Saturday afternoon at 4. It wasn't, you know, there was only 2 other people. There was the old guy watching the game with the owner, and then a quite older lady as well came in, obviously a regular. She sat down, didn't even say anything, and then the mama-san of the place immediately made her a cup of coffee, whatever she usually gets, and they just started bantering together for about half an hour. Amazing. You know, talking and laughing and giggling and whatever. And it was so warm, but it was a very different experience, obviously, Philip, to what you and I had got when we had to race there. We didn't know what to expect, and they made it very much a presentation when you and I went. Like, this is this is my Coltrane collection.
Yeah, and we could have probably stayed longer too. I think we were very conscious. Like there didn't seem to be much flexibility on the time, which is totally reasonable, of course. Like, you know, that's what we expected. But, you know, had they sort of said to us, like, you know, it's late, you've come all this way, like, let's stay open. But in fairness, you know, they're an elderly couple, and it was like 11 p.m. on a weeknight. So we weren't expecting anything else. But yeah, it must have been nice to just go in a slightly less rushed manner and really like soak it in, you know?
Oh, for sure. And you know, so I sat there. I killed a big bottle of Asahi, and then you know, I made my greetings, and I told them, I said, listen, I'm going to be back, you know, either at the end of this year or next year. But you know, it was just such a thrill to come back to see you, basically. And they were really sweet. I don't think that they get a lot of foreign visitors there. I wouldn't imagine so, because it's a little bit outside the Fukuoka city. But they were really wonderful. So after that, I get back and I'm like, oh, great. I don't have to rush because the only spot that I want to get to now, there were 5 other places in Fukuoka and the surrounding greater Fukuoka area that we've yet to visit, you nor I. And I contemplated making a real mad rush to try and hit 3 or 4 of them. And I realized, well, one of them was scratched off because they were having a bossa nova vocals night. And
that's right up your street, isn't it? You love that. You love a bit of bossa.
If you listen to OK Jazz, my music podcast, you know that's probably
wall
not
to wall
something I want
bossa
to spend
nova, isn't it? Usually
$50 and then drinks money on. So I said, okay, let me scratch that one. The second place would have required, you know, the train back to Fukuoka and then another subway ride out to a neighborhood. So at least another hour and a half to get there. And I decided, you know what, Miyazaki was so great. Coltrane was so great. And I've got a plan at 9:00 to meet someone at one of our favorite jazz bars, Brownie. I decided, you know, forget it. I'm just going to go get a ramen. Again, if you're in Fukuoka, one of the things you got to do is get a ramen. This is probably one of the ramen noodle capitals of the world. And so I'll spare you me getting lost walking around and frantically looking for.
That could be anywhere, anytime. But like, we said 6 Kyushu joints. So I mean, 5 amazing places. Unfortunately for me, I've only been to one of them so far, but they'll definitely be on the list for when I hopefully return in the autumn. So bring it home then. Take us to this 6th place. Like, where was it?
So I mentioned earlier that one of the ways that I learned about the Miyazaki places was through a Instagram contact, now hopefully a friend, who goes by the name of Randy Rhodes. on Instagram. And maybe some of our heavy metal fans out there listening will remember the name Randy Rhoads. It was Ozzy Osbourne's guitarist who passed away at a very young age in the early 1980s. So Randy Rhoads has been posting a lot of jazz Kisaten pictures from the Kyushu area in southern Japan, and he'd followed me years ago as well. So I sent him a DM in Japanese, and I said, "Hey, how you doing? Blah blah blah," and he told me about the Miyazaki places. And then I said, "Yeah, I'm going to be in Fukuoka as well. Where do you live, by the way?" And he said, "Oh, I live just outside Fukuoka." I was like, "Well, great. I noticed that you go to Brownie a lot, that you're a regular there. Are you free? Do you want to meet up and have a drink?" And he was like, "Yeah, that'd be great." So fantastic. Okay, so I grab a ramen, I make my way to Brownie, I walk in, and there's only one person there sitting at the bar, and it's Randy Rhoads. It's at Mark Randy Rhoads. His name is Ishii-san, and I would say he's a little bit of an older guy than maybe I expected. It's hard to tell, late 50s perhaps, but he's a Kyushu native. He basically spends his free time going around to music places, primarily jazz joints. And he loves to take pictures of them and take pictures of the records and do like the kind of stuff that you and I do,
Nice.
So we sat down and we started to chat and Philip, you must remember Brownie, the owner, Nakatomi-san, how unbelievably chatty and friendly.
Oh, I mean, without a doubt. Again, if you go to tokyojazzjoints.com, there's a section that we have now just dedicated to the owners, and it's the portraits that I've been lucky enough to get of the owners. And the first one up actually is the owner of Brownie, and he's posing with "Speak No Evil" by Wayne Shorter, and it's just got to be the most joyous, like just the happiest looking man. Like every time I look at that picture, it just makes me smile because he's just so, and that really is him. Like he was like that, wasn't he? We didn't just capture him.
Oh no, 100%. And even his meishi, his business card has Jazz Bar Brownie, a cartoon trumpet, and then a sort of like cartoon picture of himself with his glasses, his hat, and a gigantic smile.
Yeah.
You can see you can see the picture of him up at the Tokyo Jazz Joints site. You can see some on my Instagram feed at Mr. OK Jazz Tokyo. But yeah, he is like that. He's not putting it on. He's chatty, he's smiley, and he was, as you guys would say in your part of the world, on good form that night, I believe.
Yep.
It's an Irish expression.
Thank you for making it understandable for me.
Very, very on good form. He was talking. It was interesting because so Ishii-san, Mr. Randy Rhoads-san, was a little bit shy, I think. He seemed more of a kind of quiet character, very nice and friendly, but a little more quiet. But Nakatomi-san was talking a mile a minute, and somewhere along the line, we got on to exactly what my project and our project was. Okay, and that. Yeah, I go around the country to visit these places, but we're also documenting them. Yeah, I've got my Tokyo Jazz Joints. We've got the Tokyo, plans for maybe some more photo activities, et cetera, right? And he was just like, wow, okay, that's really great. What about have you been all around up north too? And I said, oh yeah. And of course he went to Basie. And when I mentioned Basie, you should have seen his face. He got a look of disgust on his face.
Oh. Drama,
and listen,
gossip. What is this?
Listen, we've talked a lot on this podcast about our experiences and how so often the jazz joint owners are, of course, they're all Japanese, but many of them are sort of outside mainstream Japanese society. Let's just put it that way. Okay. And so sometimes they're not bound by Japanese social norms where people tend to avoid direct speech and direct criticism. Nakatomi-san wasn't following any of that.
Oh, right. Okay. Gloves off.
He made it very clear. He was basically like, F that guy, man. And I was like, what? He said the equivalent of that in Japanese. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, oh, no, I've been there once before. He's arrogant. He's a nasty man. And I was like, really? I was like, well, I went there and, we explained our project and stuff. And he's like, did you say that you were doing a media type project? And we were like, well, we didn't say media, but we said we were doing like a photo project. And he was like, of course he would do that because he loves attention. But I went up there and my friend was going to introduce me as a jazz bar owner from Kyushu. And he just wasn't interested in the least. Didn't even invite us to our table. Very bad manners. You should always invite someone for a drink to your table. That's the proper way to be a host.
Wow.
And
this is shocking.
I saved that one for you, Philip. I knew you were going to like that.
But I mean, I think, I say shocking, but I suppose, when we got a lift down to Basie, we did even get that intimation from the owner of Royce, right, who had mentioned something about glass ashtrays flying through the air, or some sort of oblique
right.
comment that we didn't dig too deeply into. And we, of course, just trying to be polite because he'd given us a lift just down, like, what was a 5-minute drive? But I mean, these two places were functioning more or less in the same town. And yet when we sort of, out of politeness, tried to say, look, do you want to come in? Maybe rather naively, but he was like, oh no. I mean, there was no question of him joining us. So, I think probably what that highlights is that, that we undoubtedly, very much, I think the project is very much our take and our perception and our experiences of going to these places. And although there are sort of commonalities in terms of what you experience, like the atmosphere and the music, probably depending on who you are received quite differently. And I mean, we've talked even probably less of an issue now, but we have talked as well in the past about, these wouldn't necessarily have been spaces for women traditionally either. And had women gone in, particularly alone, they may not have got the nicest reception, or they may not 100%. Have been made to feel very welcome. So I think, putting aside the commonalities and how incredible these spaces are, it definitely depends. And it's not that shocking perhaps to hear that, because we had a couple of references, even other people I think had described him as Muzakashi, right? Which obviously just translates literally as difficult if you don't speak Japanese. So there's definitely always been a slight aura. And I think that's why we were so nervous when we went to meet him at Basie, sure. and why we were so surprised perhaps as well that we did get that treatment, right? We got brought to the table, we got plied with drinks and snacks, and it's certainly not our experience of it, and I know from watching...
That's the thing, right? Because if we had... Remember when we were speaking to the waitress, if we had just said like, oh, we're just some foreign tourists, can we take some pictures and, whatever, he probably wouldn't have welcomed us to the table and brought all the drinks out and given us a present. He gave me a present when we left.
That's right, yeah.
But because of the sort of project and his media exposure over the years, and you know what, I don't blame him for that at all. It's more than deserving of it because his place is a legendary venue. But it was very interesting seeing Nakatomi's reaction, and I think there may be a little bit of a Japanese regional type thing as well. I don't want to stereotype, but the general way that Japanese people will speak about people from Kyushu and people from the way north, which is where Basie is, right?
Yeah.
Is, a little bit similar to, for example, in the United States, where I come from. Like, the warmer climate people, a little bit more, perhaps a little more mellow or more chilled out. And the people way up north in New England are a little bit more standoffish. And Nakatomi-san made it very clear. He's like, yeah, great spot, but that guy, no time for him at all. And he wouldn't, he's only going to talk to you if he can get into a magazine. I was like, wow. And you remember, Philip, I mean, listen, you lived here for 20 years. It's not very often that Japanese people you have literally just met are going to speak to you in a manner like that. I mean, Nakatomi-san doesn't know me. He met me that one time that you and I went there, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't really know me. And he's immediately speaking in a very blunt manner about someone else. That's really unusual here. So I was, furiously scribbling down notes and thinking, wow, this was unexpected. But in any case, Brownie is one of those places that to me, it's not. Of course, the decor is lovely. It's a small bar. They've got tons of vinyl. He asked me, what do you want to hear tonight? And I was like, you know what? It's Saturday. Let's listen to something groovy. So he's like, oh, soul jazz, no problem. He proceeds to pull out 4 or 5 soul jazz albums that I've never heard of, never even seen before, and was just completely knocked out. You can see, again, pictures of that up on my Instagram feed. But we talked about a lot of other things with Ishii-san, my new friend, and he told me 2 anecdotes in particular that I have to share with our listeners. We were talking about his experience as you run a jazz bar, like going to gigs. Can you get to gigs, et cetera, if you're not promoting? And he was like, oh, no, I always get to the gigs because I've done a lot of promoting. I recorded at the Rudy Van Gelder studio in New Jersey. And I remembered, I think he told us that when we visited. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that vaguely rings a bell, I think, yeah.
So he had recorded at the Rudy Van Gelder studio as a sort of a producer for a Japanese jazz musician. But the next thing he told me was like, oh yeah, but occasionally it's only happened about 5 or 6 times. A random American jazz musician will come in. And I was like, really? Down here in Fukuoka? And he's like, yeah. He said, the first time it happened, I almost had a heart attack because this guy walks in. It was a middle-aged black guy who came in with his wife. And Nakatomi-san said he kind of looked at him and did a double take and was like, Mr. Freddie Hubbard? And Freddie Hubbard just come in the bar. And he's like, yeah, you know me? And Nakatomi's like, of course I know you. And he's like, please sit down. And he proceeds to bring out a bunch of Freddie's albums and he has him sign them and all of that. And he's like, what are you doing here? You're not on tour. And he's like, no. At that point, Freddie wasn't playing because remember, Freddie Hubbard had been ill and he had ruined his, how do you say, his embouchure, the way the mouth on the trumpet.
Yeah.
He couldn't play for a while, but he loved Japan very much. So he decided to take a personal trip. And while walking in Tenjin area of Fukuoka, and the Tenjin area in Fukuoka is sort of the nightlife, the Shinjuku type area, right? And he just happened to see the sign, Jazz Bar Brown.
Amazing.
And so he popped in and came up, and he started asking him questions, and Freddie Hubbard just was like, oh, I remember that one. And he was like, he didn't talk about playing with Grant Green or Herbie. He was like, Paul Chambers. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, Freddie Hubbard just kept saying, when you play with Paul Chambers, you knew you were playing jazz. And I was like, oh man, that is just so cool. Listening to jazz musicians give respect to other jazz musicians in a bar in Fukuoka. I mean, could you just picture that scene, man? Absolutely wonderful. I was overjoyed. And by this point, I probably was about 6 drinks in. So you can imagine that, I started getting quite animated.
Six drinks in, you usually start thinking you're Freddie Hubbard. Damn, 6 drinks in.
Ready to start pulling that trumpet out and blowing horn, man. So yeah, it was just a wonderful evening in a wonderful jazz bar and a great way to wrap up the trip. And so at probably around about 11 or so, I say goodbyes. I told Ishii-san, I was like, listen, I'll be in touch with you. So I make my way home. Anyway, the last thing, a couple days later, I get on Instagram. I'm starting to put up 1 or 2 pictures. And then I see this really, really nice post from Ishii-san where he doesn't actually tag me, but he says oh, I was at Jazz Bar Brownie again and I had a wonderful night of discussion. I met this guy and it's the first foreign person I've ever met. And he goes around Japan visiting jazz places and he knows everywhere. It was an amazing conversation. And all of a sudden it kicked into me. It's like, oh man, that's why Ishii-san was a little nervous. He's never met a foreigner before. This guy's literally never talked to a non-Japanese person before. And then I show up in the bar just gabbing away about, hey, I was in Miyazaki visiting all these places you told me about, being my completely usual, overly enthusiastic idiot self. It must have been a little bit overwhelming for him,
That's astonishing, though.
I never met a New Yorker.
I just feel a bit sorry for him that the first foreigner that he ever spoke to was you. But putting that aside, it is amazing, really, isn't it, when you think about that? I know certainly when I first went there, quite often, I worked the first 3 years in a junior high school, and sometimes you would get letters from, kids. And this was in urban areas like Yokohama, where they would say, oh, you're the first foreign person I ever spoke English to. And that even seemed sort of amazing in the late 90s. But to think someone's lived, that long, an older man has never had that opportunity, just shows you how, if you go to Tokyo and places like Osaka and Kyoto, you see a lot of non-Japanese and you tend to think, oh, Japan's quite international, but really it just shows you as you go further out, it's still, really not there hasn't been that same penetration of, tourism and the same penetration of people moving and like settling in Japan who are not Japanese. And it's astonishing. I think it's a really nice way to finish too, James, because, amazing trip, obviously incredibly jealous, but just to finish on that Freddie Hubbard story, again, just brings it back to this idea that, these places are in some ways shrines to certain musicians, or certainly to jazz in general, but also, a lot of these places have, been inhabited quite literally by the spirit of some of these jazz musicians to which they're dedicated. And I just think it's fascinating to try and cast your mind back and think of these people that we deify, these incredible musicians wandering around the streets in Japan the same way that we do, and then coming into these bars where they're, which are just set up to worship and to celebrate this music that they're part of. And it's just fantastic. And it's made me even more ready just to hopefully get back, and fingers crossed, and that the Japanese government will change eventually over the next couple of months, the travel rules.
Breaking news. I saved it for you. You love a little bit of breaking news.
It's never complete without some of your breaking news. This better be good. Don't get me excited.
Good friend of the program, Nick Dwyer, very well-known music journalist and TV host and radio host, producer. He does it all from New Zealand. He has been locked out of Japan since the beginning of the pandemic. And I got a text from him. He has just arrived back in Tokyo. And so it looks as if people who are coming back for work, or people who are coming for business or for tourist reasons, can now enter the country given they have the right paperwork. So this is absolute breaking news from just a day ago. We don't know how things are going to be in the next several months when you're planning it, but let's wait and see. But fingers crossed, things are looking better. And yeah, man, I've got a long list of places to share with you in addition to the ones you've already listed up. We had a lot more jazz joints to visit. And yeah, we're going to have to get to them all. And just to make you a little jealous, I do have another little little weekend planned away in Sapporo next month. 7 more joints. So that could be about 2 or 3 episodes, maybe.
Yeah, we'll see. Anyway, listen. Thank you to all of you for listening. It's really nice to be back, and we're not doing it because we've not got anything to say, but we just thought it was a good time to take a break. What we'd ideally love to do is, when I get back in autumn, is to obviously then have another season of the podcast and share our experiences and share our adventures and the new places that we go to together with you. In the meantime, there might be 1 or 2 things happening, so please keep an eye on TokyoJazzJoints.com. Please keep an eye on @TokyoJazzJoints on Instagram. And also, we're still, before anyone sends a message to ask, we're still planning to try and put out a book this year or next year. So if anyone who's listening has any contacts, any thoughts or ideas on that, we're always looking for publishing. It's not a cheap thing to do, as anyone who's put out a book will know when it comes to photography. We're looking to do it in the right way with the right person. If anyone also has any ideas of sponsorship or any way that we can get back to Japan and get some funding behind the project, because we've funded it all ourselves until now, please do reach out and give us a shout. But we're not here for the money. We're just here to share our experiences, and it's an absolute pleasure to be able to do it with all of you. So thank you again for listening. Please please share our content, send it on to people you think might be interested. And James, until we reconvene again, take it easy and look after yourself. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you as always.
As usual, buddy. Nothing like better than talking jazz joints with you, my brother. Take it easy.